15. They started dying in droves, listen to this, in the mines, the factories, and other unregulated industries. There's a little girl, she was 17 at the time, although they said that she looked more like in her 50s. And you have to understand, 50s then, no one made it to except the people who lived in the country. So she looked very, very old. And there was a Lord Ashley that looked at these children who were being so severely abused, and not only the factories but the mines. We're talking 4-year-old children who were sent down into the mines to get into small places that large men could not go. And from the time they were old enough to take orders, which was 3 and a half or 4, they would go to work in the mines. And she talked about her life and about how, she was so happy because she got to eat bread once a day. And she would eat it in the morning because there was no food for the rest of the day. And then she would go home, and then she might get a piece of meat, but not meat every day. I mean, the life that these children had was grounding. And by the time they were 16 years old, if they were lucky enough to live that old, they would be stooped and gnarled beyond comprehension. They talked about, I forget the exact name of what they did, but they would strap carts to them. And they were responsible for running up and down this hole, basically, this tunnel. And they would go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, 12 miles a day. 12 miles. They were expected to go up and back, and they'd be whipped if they were slow to do it. So, people were dying, and there was reasons for it, and the abuse of the poor, played a predominant role in that. So, all of it created fodder for a very happy bunch, and that was, and no disrespect for modern, I know we have a person in here whose father is a mortician, no disrespect to modern morticians, this has nothing to do with it, but during that time, there was also a rising middle class, and that was in the funerary business. And they had a burgeoning business indeed. I like this. When business orders are received from parties painfully bereaved, 5 minutes' time is all we ask to execute the mournful task. There's Ashley, and it's a professional journal of funeral directors at the time. And there was this man, and yes, it may have been tongue-in-cheek, and yet other scholars say, no, he meant it. And he bemoans the fact that doctors were trying to save patients, and darn it, they had a rightful right to die. So this whole concept of new medicine at the time did not really go over well with the mortician said. Now, why was so much attention put on to the funerary business, into this whole process of death and dying? Why did it go beyond just giving our last respects? Well, during that time, it was all about what the aristocracy did. And Queen Victoria made death, well, she actually made it very cool. Because Prince Albert died in 1861, and she denoted the black was to be an official color worn by many women. And since she did it, of course they did it, because in their culture at the time, you could not afford to be the other. And the other is like living in a small town, and I think many of us do, and that is, the person that's just a little quirky, a little different, maybe, that all of a sudden they're kind of outside the good graces of the community. And during that time, if you were part of the aristocracy, your lands, your title, everything you own could be taken away from you if the rest of society would close their ranks against you. So if the queen wore black and thought it was cool, then you were going to wear black too. So black was worn. She actually wore black until the day she died, mourning Prince Albert. So it was conform or die. And this, I have to say, also started really separating the classes even farther. Because if you were poor, there's a story, and this is rather poignant. The constable had to be called to an apartment, or I guess they call them flats, to a flat in London. And this family had a little 3-year-old, and she had been dead for a couple of weeks, and they popped her in a corner because they didn't know what else to do to her, with her, because they didn't want to bury her without proper accoutrements. It meant a lot to them. So they were really desperately trying to save their money. Of course, the constable came in, he took possession of the body, and they buried it. But, you know, it's very important. The death culture really took hold. Okay, we're going to talk about the accoutrements of the Victorian funeral industry. This was big. I mean, think about it. Matching coaches and horses, white for children and women who died in childbirth, and black for everyone else. Plumes on humans and horses, peacock feathers, of course. And that's why the association between peacock feathers and death, you know, became intermingled. And I look at it today because I'll go to weddings and I'll see peacock feathers everywhere. And I wonder if they really know the history and the symbolism, yes, of the peacock feather. But they also had people like mutes. Now, mutes were a rascally bunch. They would go to the tavern and try to find the most sober individual, and they would pay them to do this. And that photograph right there is a couple of mutes. And what they would do is symbolically guard the dead. One would be in the chapel, perhaps, next to the chapel door, or if the funeral, the laying out, if you will, was being done at home, they would stand guard at the door. So that was their job. They also wanted standard bearers, those who could afford it. And standard bearers are those that had the long poles, and they have this little black triangular flag. Now, why would they want that? Anybody? Why would you want a standard bearer? This is the middle class. They want to look and live just like the aristocracy. So the king has standard bearers, does he not? That's right. So they wanted one too. So that's what they did. It was social climbing. It was social climbing, and this, I'll tell you a little story. This is funny. I had an assistant a few years ago, and she'd been to 3 wakes in a week. I said, Rachel, wow. I said, that's a lot of wakes. And she told me, she said, Kate, you got to understand, around here, a wake is a social event. So we're not that far from it, are we? It was a social event. They would even have gifts for those close to the recently departed, usually gloves, handkerchiefs, or rings. Coffins, the coffins had to be lined richly, just like today, and of course, a comfortable wool mattress. And of course, women especially, fashion, but with a purpose. And fashion was really interesting because when you were in full mourning, you would wear the very long veil, you know, and in public it would be pulled in front of your eyes. You were away from the world. Now, there was a little bit of superstition there too, because somebody that had just died in their family, they did not want you looking straight at them. And do you know why? Because superstitiously they thought, well, that ghost, her ex-husband or former husband could be attached. And we don't want her looking at us because he's not going to notice us and attach himself to us. Interesting, isn't it? Okay, then half mourning. After a woman has been in mourning for about 9 months to a year, then she could go to half mourning. In half mourning, you could wear something like a very dull lavender, almost a grayish lavender, or gray itself. Now, if it was for a child, if a child had died in your family, then 6 months was usually the length of time that you would go. But for men, men, yes. Men would be in mourning, usually 6 months. But did you know that a man could officially go out in mourning? Well, anytime a man wanted to. Yeah. Yeah, so if that sweet young thing, I always think about P.T. Barnum and his poor suffering, long-suffering wife, and she drops dead, and he's like an Ireland going, oh, well, hey, baby, want to get married? Yeah. So really, and there was no repercussion. Women really at that time were under a lot more scrutiny as far as how we purported ourselves when we were in public. Any of y'all watch? Let me get a show of hands here. Gone with the Wind. Oh yeah. Oh, classic. Well, do you remember when she shows up at the ball? That's right, in her black dress, and people were just aghast. And they actually moved away from her. There was a lot of social symbolism to dress. Jewelry and a little DNA. Now this is important in that we have here, what they would do, they would take hair and they would braid it and they would keep it, in honor of the person that had passed. And at the top we have what a member of the aristocracy might wear, and of course it's finely braided hair in a gold, brooch. And you would wear this in public in honor of the deceased. And then here we have, right here, we have 3 little pink bows. And obviously a poor mother had done this in honor of her children. And what she would do is actually when she went to maybe church or somewhere, she would dress herself in that. And then over to my left, your right, is all the other accoutrements that went with Victorian mourning. But there's more. Because not only do we dress ourselves, we dress our homes. And here's examples of, and I don't want to steal Stephanie's thunder. Stephanie down there? No, you don't have to come on. I was just going to, no, we're not at the end yet. But I was going to say that Stephanie will be doing superstitions here in just a second. But, so I'll just steal this morning, Steph. But the mirror, they would cover it because they were always afraid that the spirit would be confused and go into the mirror. Because even, during the Victorian era, mirrors were pretty fascinating, even at that point, even though they've been around for a while, okay? And this whole idea of mirror worlds, it was in the back of people's minds. In fact, during this era, St. Francisville, Louisiana, and we've all heard of the Myrtle's plantation. Supposedly you can see reflections of the little girls and their mother in the mirror there as you walk into the hallway to the left. And then, of course, if you were wealthy, you would dress your front doors like this. Now, there were, multiple purposes for this. One was so people would know as they passed in carriage that someone had died in your household. And another is that, let's face it, it was a cool thing to do. I hate to put it that way. It's very socially acceptable. You had to do it, especially if you were wealthy. Now, another thing they would do is to leave the door slightly ajar. And that way, because it was a different era, people would come and they would come into your home. And it was so you wouldn't be opening and closing the door and disturbing those, within. So they would leave it slightly ajar and you would go in and leave, your food and say a few words and then leave. Now, I will tell you, this is an interesting thing. And that is when they would go in front of the house, line up for the funeral carriage ride to the final resting place. The rich would send empty carriages. Yeah, with the driver. Yeah, because in the back of the ride, they're thinking, I'm not going to die when he died. When you think about it, even though they weren't really acutely aware of some of this, it's almost like by instinct, survival instinct, that they set up social norms to protect themselves from some of it. So they actually would send a carriage with a driver and no one inside, just as a tip of the hat sort of thing. Now when they got to the graveyards, it was a whole different thing. The graveyards at the time, and we'll get into that in just a little bit, were really a mess. It got worse for these people. Of course, we have this wonderful custom of flowers at weddings. Oh, I'm sorry, sorry guys. And I have to say, before I go any further, this is Stephanie, my daughter, and this is Alex, and he's our EVP specialist, and she's one of our photographers and the investigators, and they just got engaged a few days ago. Welcome to the family, Alex. So you see where the wedding thing's going, but this is what they would do, of course, at funerals. And it's because nobody got involved back then. In fact, embalming started to become more important because of war. We had the Civil War, and I've got a photograph, not in here, but of, they called it, battlefield embalming. Very crude, but they would do it to ship bodies back home. And of course, once World War I came along, and let me know too when I'm getting to 45 minutes, guys. I thought this would work, but it went off on me, okay? All right, Eric, thanks. So anyway, they would cover the smell of the bodies with flowers. I know it's such a nice thing that we do today, but that's what it was for during that time. And even the flowers would have symbols attached to them. And if you will notice, you know, like right here, we have the two birds and the gate representing his soul flying into the gates of heaven. So a lot of symbolism went on during that time. Very acutely aware of it. I have to preface this, and I will tell you that this is the last time I'm going to be giving this presentation for a while. Believe it or not, when I started this presentation, I thought, okay, all the research for it. I thought, all right, I'm going to be living with the living. I